Thank you very much, everyone, for coming on this beautiful day after the ugly weather. I see a lot of Latin American faces here and non-Latin American faces too. So this is a real honor to have today Professor Tulia Falleti. She's originally from Argentina. She's the class of 1965 turned Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the director of the Latin American and Latino Studies Program and Senior Fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute for Health Economics and the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Decentralization and Subnational Politics in Latin America, which earned the Donna Lee Bancott Award for the best book in political institutions by the Latin American Studies Association. Tulia also does work on decentralization, federalism, authoritarianism, and qualitative methods, which have appeared in the main journals of political science. So please join me in welcoming Tulia Falleti. Bienvenida.
Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you so much to Claudia Avellaneda and to the organizers of the Ostrom workshop for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I had the chance to meet Elinor Ostrom when I was a postdoctoral fellow at UBC, and I was always, an admirer of her and her work, which I've cited extensively in my own work and has been really an intellectual guidance. So it's an honor to be here. So as Professor Avellaneda just mentioned, in my first book, I studied decentralization reforms and their effect on the intergovernmental balance of power between presidents, governors, and mayors. Towards the end of that project, it became very clear to me that the consequences of decentralization on local politics and provision of local public goods hinged on local civic participation. There was really what in Mexico is referred as a claroscuro, a mix of results depending on local variables and local conditions. So for my second research project, I tackled the issue of what are the different types and features of local civic engagement. A large part of this project has been developed over the years with graduate students, 2 former graduate students and 1 current graduate student. So with Emerick Davis, we first looked at the individual level determinants of participation at the local level in Bolivia using survey data, both before and after the left turn. And that's an article that was published in CPS in the year 2017. With another former graduate student of mine, Thea Riofrancos, more recently we published an article that asked why is it that some participatory institutions, which I'll define in a moment, gain institutional strength while others remain very weak, even when originating in the same international norms. So with very similar origins, both in terms of legal infrastructure, as well as in terms of the social process that leads to their adoption, then we found that comparing the cases of prior consultation in Bolivia and Ecuador, we see 2 very different paths of institutional strengthening. And now I'm working with another graduate student, Santiago Puñal, on local health, participation in public health. Both we're looking at comparatively and also we are digging deep in the case of Argentina. And that's ongoing work. But stemming from the work that Thea Riofrancos and I did is that I wrote this chapter that we are discussing today. This chapter is part of a book that is going to be edited by Dan Brinks, Maria Victoria Murillo, and Steve Levitsky. And the book is going to be on weak institutions. So they invited me to write a contribution for the book that is largely informed, as you may have seen, by the introduction that they wrote for the book, where they define what are weak institutions. So what I tried to do in this in this chapter is to probe the idea of what accounts for a strong institution. So flipping a little bit the discussion, and instead of giving an example of a weak institution, showing how an institution can transition from being weak or a window dressing institution to becoming a strong institution. And in the process of doing that, I draw from the Bolivian case and the institution of prior consultation, but I also take this chapter as an opportunity to put forward a conceptualization of institutional strengthening, which I see as having two main elements: societal compliance and state enforcement. For the institution that I'm interested, enforcement is done by the state. And compliance having two dimensions: legitimacy and efficacy, which I take from the work of Ana Arjona. So that's one of the main goals of these articles, to expand and put forward a conceptualization of institutional strengthening, and also to elaborate more on an idea that was in germinal form in the article with Theo Francos, but here I had room to expand, which is this idea of indigenous political incorporation. What does it mean to incorporate the indigenous movements? And start to think, and this is where I particularly welcome feedback and comments, start to think about ways of operationalizing indigenous incorporation. We know a lot about labor incorporation from the work of corporatist scholars in general, but also for the case of Latin America, from the work of Ruth Behrens and David Collier. But I'm trying to think about using that template, perhaps, to think about incorporation of other groups once the corporatist state is in crisis in Latin America after the 1990s. So I don't know how much longer you want me to talk. I have some slides that could work us through some of the main question, concepts, and ideas of the paper. I'm glad to go into that.
Maybe they can be used during the time that you answer questions. Maybe they are relevant to that.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Tulia. So let's open to questions. Federica?
Yes, thank you. I found this paper very, very interesting. I have a series of comments and on a variety of topics. One has to do with a sort of like a connection between compliance and enforcement, and another one has to do with a sort of like a suggestion for a different pitch, or perhaps another literature that I think this paper, this work speaks to, and I didn't see addressed here. So the comment about compliance and enforcement is an analytical one, because it seems to me that the two concepts are mutually exclusive. In terms of costs, the more compliance you get, the least state enforcement you need. And so I was sort of like confused as to why you sort of like how you are conceptualizing the two as mutually reinforcing as opposed to mutually exclusive. The second question, it has to do with the concept of incorporation, and it seems to me that this is a very important contribution to a larger discussion about how inclusive political institutions come about. So the whole Asimov and Robinson story. And this is a story that has like a greater texture than Asimov and Robinson, that takes into account communities and actors that perhaps are not as prevalent in the sort of like a larger theories of Asimov and Robinson. And so I wonder if there is a way in which this idea, the set of ideas, could be sort of like a more, made to more directly speak to this broader issue of inclusion, particularly when it comes to sort of like a marginalized actors that we don't see as sort of like a operating that efficiently or so in a useful way in the context of political and economic development.
Okay. So are compliance and enforcement mutually reinforcing or exclusive? the way in which I'm thinking of enforcement is such that it's not only about fining or about applying penalties, but about the possibility of those being there. So in this regard, I think that they are mutually reinforcing in that, to the extent that we have more societal compliance with an institutional norm, it will be easier for the state. And the reason, I should make like a brief parenthesis here, the reason in which I'm thinking of the state as the enforcer, sometimes societal groups are enforcers or of cultural norms. So, the reason I'm thinking of the state as enforcer is that the participatory institutions that I'm studying are all state sanctioned. So they are all state institutions where the state is responsible for enforcement. So I'm going to talk about enforcement as something that is led by the state, but obviously it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it could be societal groups who are also in charge of enforcement of institutions, particularly cultural norms. So what I think I'm saying in this paper, and the way in which I'm thinking, is that for the state it's far easier to enforce a norm or an institution if that institution has high levels of legitimacy in society. Otherwise, people find ways of cheating that are harder to monitor. So this is why I think they are mutually reinforcing. This doesn't mean that enforcement always implies penalties or fines for violations. So in that regard, yes, as compliance goes up, we would expect perhaps less enforcement resources needed for this particular institution, right? But I would still expect that some level of vigilance has to be there. Ultimately, if it becomes a societal norm to the point where you don't need enforcement anymore, then I see your point that they are exclusionary. But in general, there is always, the threat that someone is monitoring our behavior, and this is what I'm thinking about. Because, I think this is related again to this idea that these are institutions that are state-sanctioned. So ultimately, the state is always the warrantor of the agreements that are reached by these institutions. In terms of your other question, I think it's an excellent point, and you are right that when we think about political incorporation of any societal group or sector, do bring us back to the issue of inclusive institutions and processes of democratization, or in the terms of Acemoglu and Robinson, perhaps political development. I think because of the historical way in which they were thinking about the origins of these institutions, and because of the fact that this was thought from a very liberal representative framework of thinking about democracy, they only looked at enfranchisement of male population and in particular of working classes, how they are included. But both in history and in theory, we can study the gradual process by which other groups are included. My colleague Don Till, for example, has a forthcoming book on democratization processes that entail the inclusion of women. So systematically studying the inclusion of women in political systems that the traditional literature on decentralization has not paid attention to, because for them 50% of the male enfranchised was enough to consider a case as a case of democratization, right? So, the recent work on ethnic rights in Latin America has also looked at the incorporation of indigenous and Afro descendant populations in the region, for which, partially as a result of neoliberal reforms, partially as a result of multiculturalism, there had been new legal formal institutional ways of including since the 1990s. So we are also thinking about these. And here, for example, to me, it has become very important the work of Tiana Pachel, who looks at incorporation of Afro-descendants in Colombia and Brazil. So absolutely, I think we can think of political incorporation as a gradual process that has to do with the process of democratization that some authors dated to a particular time in particular point in time, and for that particular point in time, working classes and male enfranchisement of male was important, but as we extend, we learn more about democratization processes. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Jessica?
Okay, I thought this was wonderful. I work on kind of similar issues in Africa, so it's really useful to have a comparative context. So I have three kinds of questions, and I'm going to try to keep them somewhat short. One is sort of about the case, and the other two are sort of more theory-based. So about the case, one question I had was the way that you're operationalizing legitimacy seemed to be that communities preferred or demanded free or informed consent. And the reason why I'm sort of uncertain about that as sort of a way of understanding legitimacy is I would expect legitimacy to be, if we think about it as buy-in, right, kind of, then we would think about it as sort of choosing something over maybe other possible options, right? But given the ILO and the sort of, in some ways, still quite top-down idea about how FPIC should work, it's sort of isn't it possible it's just this is what's available and so we're going to ask for it, as opposed to we actually have some organic, I don't like that word, but buy-in to this particular institutional form. So I was just curious as to whether there were other evidence for sort of institutional legitimacy by the indigenous communities, whether they had experiences with other forms of institutions or something that led them to particularly prefer this one. So in terms of the theoretical questions, first, one had to do with sort of thinking through the question of, you talk about sort of the importance of legitimacy and compliance, legitimacy and effectiveness, efficacy as part of compliance. And this seems to be about those concepts for the local indigenous communities in the area, but the effectiveness of this institution relies not only on the state and the community, but also on the firm in this case. And you sort of referenced that literature, but I was just curious, in this case, where you really need the buy-in of that third actor in some ways for this to work, how can we think about where the firm fits in your theory? It's not really the state and it's sort of society, but we think of it as having very, very different interests in terms of the way in which the costs and benefits of FPIC line up, vis-a-vis the local community. Finally, there's just this sort of broader, overarching question about history more generally speaking. One version of the question that you're posing in this chapter, or contribution to the edited article, or edited book, is about the fact that institutions, you could have the same institutions in similar contexts, but they have different trajectories or different outcomes. And it struck me, I just happened to be reading February 2018 APSR with Ben Arn Page's article about exactly that question. But their answer is more about cultural histories and repertoires of institutions, with the idea that past experiences with different institutions shape how current institutions affect outcomes. And so I was just curious, I don't know if I would raise it necessarily as a competing argument to yours or a competing theory, but I was just curious if there's a way to incorporate thinking about that in your case or in your theory.
That's a great, I'll start with the last one. I think that's a great suggestion. I haven't seen their you said this Ben Ansel with whom?
It's Bednar and Page.
Okay.
Yeah, Jenna Bednar and Scott Page. It's a totally different methodology, but the sort of idea is somewhat, so they're asking us a very similar question.
Okay, so then I may have seen actually an earlier version of a formal model.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, for what I recall, it has more to do with diversity. I'll look back at it, I didn't see an obvious connection when I read the manuscript version of that article. Yeah, I'll read it again, just to be sure. So thank you for the recommendation. In terms of legitimacy and buy-in, I like the idea in which you are thinking about legitimacy as buy-in of one option vis-a-vis others. I think this certainly comes in when you see groups discussing different institutional formats, say in a constitutional convention, right? So there you see competing options over the features that prior consultation should take, for instance. This was very relevant in the 1997 Constitutional Convention in Ecuador, for example, where there was a group of conventionalists who wanted a binding prior consultation, and others who were okay with the idea that prior consultations were just to make recommendations, but that they did not have, that the resolutions or the agreements that were reached were not necessarily binding for the state. So there we see, in effect, different positions within, in this case, the indigenous movement and their representatives with regards to how the institution must be materialized, regulated down the road. And it is true also that this is an institution, prior consultation being the right of indigenous communities to be consulted every time there is a mega infrastructure or extraction project that could affect their environment or land. So this right comes from the International ILO Convention 169. So in this regard, to a certain extent, is available and given and not chosen necessarily. Although there is a very interesting political process by which Convention 169 comes about, in which representatives of labor had a lot to do, and organized representatives of indigenous movements as well. So, if we dig deeper into that, I'm sure we would find some connections to social movements. Something I haven't done yet, but I want to do in the future. So the way in which I would think of this is that what indigenous communities or indigenous social movements are doing is layering rights. So you find other institutions, say like, for example, the legitimacy that stems from the organization of the AIU in Bolivia. There are indigenous groups who would like the local governments to be organized according to their ancestral rules. In Mexico, this has been granted to some over 400 communities who are ruled by usos y costumbres. So in Bolivia or in other places, this is known as autonomy, territorial autonomy or governmental autonomy. So this is another way of pursuing another institution that they consider to be legitimate in terms of their cultural history and repertoires. So to me, it's not so much a choice of A or B, what grants legitimacy to A or B, but rather the fact that these groups are demanding A, B, C, D, and think of them as rights that can be added up. Now, if we take, for example, the case of prior consultation, in Colombia, it was contested. So the only case in which I know that the institution was challenged for not being legitimate was at the very origins of implementing the institution in Colombia, where there was a community that said, no, this is a way of having us to accept extraction, and we don't want to accept extraction. You are cheating us with this institution, thinking us that we are, making any decision here. But this, so that is to me an example of the institution being illegitimate in the eyes of these actors who think that it's there not for the the purpose of having them participate, but rather for the ultimate goal of extraction, and they do not see it as a legitimate institution. But I haven't found any other incidents of that type of opposition. And what I found in the case of Bolivia is that over and over, what actors ask is that it be implemented. So if the government comes into a natural reserve area and starts building a highway or starts extracting, the communities ask that there should be a prior informed consultation before. So it's from the act of demanding it in whatever format is currently institutionalized, even if it might not be the optimal for everybody. But it's from the act of demanding it that I extract the idea, or I infer that it is legitimate among those actors. But as I say in the paper, this is very hard to measure observationally. We're just assuming that because they are demanding it is legitimate in their eyes, and also because they are complying with it through the process of implementing the reforms, and where there are problems, they're asking that it be done again, not that this not be done anymore. Let's replace it with something else.
Dean?
Yeah, it wasn't clear to me what you meant by a strong institution, and as opposed to, say, an efficient institution. So the Soviet Union was a strong institution, arguably not efficient. So I'm not sure what the importance of strong versus weak is. And in the case of hydrocarbons, it was never clear to me who owned the underground resources, and that I think would be a strong, efficient institution, clear ownership of underground assets. But I didn't get that in this particular case study. So it's kind of two questions.
Yeah. So I'll start with the last one first. Every national government will tell you that the underground reservoirs are nationally owned, that they don't belong to the communities that sit over land, that the land, the surface land, is something that communities can claim authority upon, but what lies underneath, it belongs to the national government.
US or Canada?
I think that's
Well, yeah, but I mean, so it's not so that's a structure or institution that's very important. How what's the administrative structure of the bureaucracy that's going to administer underground resources, and what size the plots are, and all this stuff is the key details to thinking about efficient hydrocarbon utilization.
Absolutely.
I didn't get a sense of what that was in the paper.
Yeah. Perhaps I pursue more homogeneity there than there is, because the U.S. and Canada are different. But throughout Latin America, these are considered national prerogatives. However, because the extraction has to happen through surface land, is where negotiations come with the indigenous communities over different types of compensation because of use of land. But you're right that this is something I should include in the paper. I can tell you that, for example, in the 1994 Constitutional Convention in Argentina, the provinces of Patagonia, where there are large reservoirs of oil and natural gas, wanted this to be a provincial owned resource, and it wasn't approved. But it might be a matter of what's the balance of power between those who have these resources and within each case. And sorry, the second question.
I wasn't clear to me what strong.
Oh, a strong institution.
Whether that
Okay,
strong is good in and of itself.
If a strong is good in and of itself, well, there is a long literature in the social sciences that says that's the case, and I cite, for example, Max Weber saying that the strong rational bureaucracy is necessary for economic development. Just to cite, Acemoglu and Robinson, strong political institutions are also important to economic development. Or Douglas North, the strong institutions are important for economic development.
I don't think that's a fair way to think about North. I mean, so China is a very strong institution in terms of the Communist Party control. Is that an efficient institution? I don't know.
I mean, what is the institution? Is it the Communist Party?
Well, I'm just asking you to clarify what you mean by strong here, since it's your term. And what
Sure.
weak would be in some examples, maybe in the context of.
Yeah, because I think it's important, in your examples you're referring to China or the USSR, and there, I agree that these are regimes that have centralized power and could perhaps be identified as strong central governments. But if we're thinking about the institutions, then we'd have to think, well, are we talking about the Communist Party in the USSR? It was a strong institution. Are we talking about the Chinese Communist Party as strong institutions? In both cases, I would say yes, absolutely. Those are both very strong institutions. Is it based on legitimacy, compliance, and enforcement? Well, it's more based on enforcement than legitimacy and compliance. So then we have to see, what makes people to act the way the institution wants them to act. In those two cases, repression or the fear of enforcement or the fear of threats for deviant behavior is largely what explains compliance, not so much legitimacy or efficacy even. So to get to the more general question of what do I mean by a strong institution, let me put my chapter in the context of the volume with which is dialoguing. So for the editors, what defines a strong institution is the distance between what we'd expect to be the outcome of whatever process or institutional result we expect to see before the institution was in place, and that outcome after the institution has been applied. So say, I don't know, party organization or organization at the local level before you have the Communist Party and after you have the Communist Party, or mobilization in protest, or compliance with local rules before you have the Communist Party and after you have the Communist Party. So whatever effect you think the centralized Communist Party may have in China or in the Soviet Union, you measure that outcome before the institution existed and after, or with the counterfactual. What would happen in this country if this institution didn't exist? What would happen, for example, to tax collection if we had competitive electoral system at the local level in China? So you measure those institutions before and after, and according to them, the strength of the institution is the distance between those two outcomes. And what I say in this paper is, this is great if we can indeed measure the institutional outcome before and after. This gives us a way to measure, operationalize and measure institutional strength. However, it doesn't tell us anything. If institutions, by definition, are norms that seek to change people's behavior, it doesn't tell us anything about why would people change behavior. It doesn't tell us anything about how or why we got from IO or PO to IO. And there is where I say, well, in looking at institutional strength, we need to look into compliance and enforcement and disaggregate these concepts. So I propose two dynamic ways of thinking about compliance and enforcement based on the characteristics of the institutions I'm interested in, which is socially demanded, legally sanctioned formal institutions. So I'm not saying this necessarily will work for any institution or cultural norm that you may apply this to, but for the type of institutions that are state-sanctioned, legal and formal, you could ask these questions along figures 1 and 2 to get at whether this is an institution that is strong or not, both on the compliance side and on the enforcement side. Does that help to understand how I'm thinking of a strong institution?
I find your question very intriguing. But I wonder, isn't it possible that the incorporation of all mobilized groups is going to weaken the institution? And I feel that complex dimension is not well revealed. There are many cases, real-world cases of, we've been talking about China. I'm from Africa. You have many governmental structures that are weak because of this incorporation of different groups, which builds a patronage system, and so the institution at the end of the day is very weak. And the cases which have not done that, like Rwanda, the institutions are stronger than some of these other countries. So probably we could be talking about the social origins of institutional weaknesses.
I wonder. I'm not sure. What I can tell you based on the literature on participatory institutions around the world, including Africa, is that when they are promoted from above by the leadership, or when they are promoted by international donors or international institutions as examples of diffusion of good practices, they tend to be short-lived in time. They tend to disappear over time as institutional practices. They are not implemented anymore. When the donors leave, the institution doesn't remain, or they are not complied with. So just based on observational studies of participatory institutions, including development councils in Africa, I can tell you that what we found is that those institutions that were demanded by mobilized social groups tended to stay there for far longer time. One example is participatory budgeting. In the case of Brazil, Organizaciones Territoriales de Bases, OTVs in Bolivia, and there are others. I mean, prior consultation as well. Does this mean that these institutions don't become captured at points, or that they don't have deficiencies in their functioning? No, of course it doesn't mean that. Of course they could be captured. The question is whether, what I'm referring by political incorporation is the same than capturing an institution. And I don't think it is, but perhaps I should be clear about this. So let me, here. So I said before that by indigenous political incorporation, or you could think about, incorporation of mobilized social groups, we are borrowing the definition of labor incorporation and Collier. So when do you know if you have had the incorporation of these mobilized social groups? But they say is when you have at least a partially successful attempt by the state to legitimate and shape the institutionalized movement. So it's when the state sees them as an interlocutor, and that relationship between the mobilized group and the state becomes institutionalized in some form. This is very general. So what I'm trying to look is, how does this happen? And what I've identified, or I started to identify in this paper, is that it can happen through the state by inclusion of these people in the bureaucracy. It can happen through the political party system because they become represented and they run and they win positions, and from there they have a relationship with the state. Or it can happen through civil society, like it happened before with labor corporations. You could have groups or NGOs that regularly interact with the state. What is key to me is that as they do these, they become agents of the process of regulation and implementation of the institutions. That's what is key. That in designing how the institution is going to go from the paper to the practice, these people are there in those negotiations or dialogues or conventions or legislatures, and they are part of the process by which they decide how these are going to be implemented. And I think that's what gives the institution, therefore, more legitimacy and more of a chance of it being complied. Now, as these institutions get on the ground, you will find that, well, in fact, there are many different indigenous groups, if you have, is there room for conflict? Yes, there is room for conflict. Is there room for capture? Yes, there is room for capture. So, I mean, I'm not sure I'm providing with the best tools of governance for all situations possible. What I'm saying is, you are more likely to have a strong institution if you incorporate the mobilized social actors during the process of regulation, of seeing how you pass the institution from paper to practice and implementation. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you very much. This is a really interesting project, and I especially find the kind of multi-level governance component embedded in here really interesting about how the prior consultation from the ILO comes down and is used as a tool for subnational and marginalized groups to wrest power. I have two kind of broad sets of questions or things to consider. The first is, especially since you mentioned in your opening remarks that you want to take this project further with building out this indigenous political incorporation component. I'd really like to see, I think that's excellent, I'd like to see in future iterations more attention paid to scope conditions, which might be some of what some of the other other people have questioned you on. So for instance, in Bolivia, 40% of the population identifies as indigenous. The Bolivian case, especially because of the importance of MOS in all of this, indicates that there needs to be a certain threshold of indigenous people who identify and will be willing to vote on that particular identity in order for kind of the at least the political party-based components of incorporating indigenous peoples into the national government to work. So I'm really curious to hear more about the scope conditions, especially, and with the Bolivia case, I wonder if the Cochabamba water wars was an important condition here as well, because you also have a very clear expression of power and willingness to go to the streets and a protest culture. So I really think kind of building out the scope conditions where you think that indigenous groups can be incorporated into political institutions in meaningful ways is important here. And in tandem to that, I think that it would be really useful, and maybe this also pulls at the previous person who asked a question, his concerns. It'd be really useful to pull out more of who is actually participating in the consultations and how are they participating. Is participation really done in a way that just perpetuates kind of hierarchical structures, or is it really inclusive? And you can imagine that consultations can give vast power to a few important indigenous leaders, or can really be participatory. So I think delving more into providing more description of what's happening in the prior consultations would be really helpful here for you and for your readers. My second set of questions, it has more to do with the specific case. You make an argument that this is a hard case, and I found that really quite interesting because when it comes to natural resource extraction, communities on which resources are based oftentimes are the sites of a lot of hard bargaining and conflict. And so to me, it would seem that that these communities have a lot of bargaining power vis-a-vis both the state and and whatever the firm is that's extracting. So I'd like to hear more about why it's the case that you think that these communities really have been marginalized and don't have as much bargaining power. And I'd also like to see a little bit more about the context in which the bargaining is happening, because like Jess said, I agree that the firm recedes from your discussions. One way to think about this is that prior consultations are a way for the government to basically push back against the firm, especially if it's a multinational firm. And this is occurring at a period of time in which Bolivia is abrogating its bilateral investment treaties. You have the ILO coming. From the ILO, you're getting this prior consultation idea, but from the international investment legal framework, you're also getting these kind of international arbitrations, and so perhaps prior consultation is being used as a legitimating way to push back against investor-state dispute settlement. So I'd like to see a little bit more wrestling with
Okay, I wrote a list for questions, but perhaps there were more. More attention to the scope conditions. In this version, what I try to say is that this applies to institutions that are socially demanded. So when I think of compliance and enforcement in this way, I'm thinking about state formal state-sanctioned institutions that are socially demanded. So that's the way in which I frame it so far. Now you're asking me if, part of the scope of conditions should also be what I would think of, and perhaps you put it this way as an alternative hypothesis, whether this institution is more likely to, the institution of prior consultation or any institution of recognition of indigenous rights is far more likely where there is a sizable indigenous population. And I put that not as a condition, but rather as an hypothesis, something that needs to be tested comparatively. Is it true that where these institutions of indigenous rights are more likely where you have large indigenous constituencies who could be articulated in political parties? And my presumption is that hypothesis doesn't hold, but I haven't done systematic study. But let me tell you a couple of reasons why I don't think that hypothesis holds. One is historic. The large population of Bolivians, actually, if you counted them 10 years, it was 60%. There was a drop in self-identification in the last census from 60 to 40. So, if you had it, then why not before? Why was it that before you had this articulation and only you had it as of 2006? So it doesn't make sense historically. And I can tell you all the reasons why it didn't happen. It has to do with the 52 revolution and the corporatist state and many other things. But it doesn't also make sense comparatively. Colombia put forward very strong indigenous and Afro-descendant rights that they do enforce very heavily, and the population is less than 3%. So Guatemala being the other case, it has a very large indigenous population, more than 30% of the population, and yet doesn't have the recognition and implementation of indigenous rights. So I think it's worth to have it as an alternative hypothesis. My sense is that it doesn't work. Who is actually and how is participating in prior consultation? There are some articles written by anthropologists who get at this issue on individual cases. And from having read that literature, what I can tell you is that there is great variation. So what I did in the paper was to devote, a page and a half or 2 pages to the issue of results. And there I say that, you have communities such as Agua Norte where there were environmental societal leaders. Societal leaders trained in environmental management, who were able to negotiate in almost an equal footing with the companies regarding changes to the license and changes to the project. But in many other communities, this doesn't exist, and the hierarchical relationship is both within communities, because the elders must be the ones deciding alone, or the leaders, whoever they are, but also a hierarchical relationship between the firm and the company, because the firm has the resources and the information, and the community doesn't. So between the firm and the community, I meant to say before. So, is there deliberation? No, these are not deliberative forums. I have some photos where you will see people sitting around, but this doesn't mean that they are necessarily deliberating. Most of the discussion has to do with the level of compensations. So what will be the appropriate compensations? And in some cases also, what is the environmental or the impact for the community of having, a pipe go this way than that way, or, going around some sites or whatever. So at most the community, proposes reforms to the projects that are not extremely substantial. I also say in the paper that out of 58 projects that for which I could get information that, have been completed or are underway, only in one the dispute got to the courts, and even then it was approved to move forward. So this is not an instrument for avoiding extraction, not in Bolivia. It could be in Canada, where actually people in the northern, indigenous tribes in the northern of BC have stopped extractive projects with privatization, but not in Bolivia. So I think I'm very clear about the limits that this has comparatively. I didn't do in-depth case analysis, as some of our colleagues in anthropology have done. So I cannot report more on individual cases. But I do think that the paper does lay out the limitations that this has as a participatory institution. Okay. I think when I talk about a hard case for institutional strengthening, you are interpreting in a slightly different way as to whether the community has bargaining power. If you look at all the other extractive economies in the region, at least extractive in terms of mineral or hydrocarbons, Peru has a prior consultation law, but only very slowly is applying it. Colombia, Ecuador, you don't see the type of application of the institution in the systematic way that you see in Bolivia. So, why don't those communities also have the bargaining power that you're talking about? What I'm trying to say is that this is an institution that, citing Rodriguez Garavito, is taking place in these minefields because the interests of the state, communities, and firms are so diverse over issues that are very dear to the companies and to the state. For the state to withdraw revenues, and to the companies to invest in projects that sometimes are investment plans of 30, 40 years. So in that regard, I think that it's a hard case for institutional strengthening because there is so much at stake. I take your point that the community does have bargaining power, but I think that's the result of how the institution has evolved in this case, because in other cases they don't.
Let's take another question.
Okay, yeah, and I can talk to you about firms later. There is a very interesting dissertation written by a woman who now is graduated. She graduated from Texas A&M, who looked at the bilateral agreements and renegotiations. I don't know if you know whom I'm talking about. Her name is escaping me. She has a Northern European name, and she looked at the negotiations. What it seemed I don't think private consultation was used as leverage against the firms. I think that was happening under totally separate channels.
Tony?
I know time is short, so I'll ask just a very brief question, but the idea of a strong institution, it sounds like it's an outcome, and I understand that. What if the outcome is negative, right? It could still be strong, so I'm thinking, or what happens if your indicators are conflicting? Maybe like the bilateral agreements might be GDP goes up, but maybe inequality goes down, or maybe both go down, right? So I was wondering your thoughts on a strong institution maybe having negative consequences for society. Does that mean institutional strengthening happens through that enforcement pathway versus a compliance pathway story?
I think in that case what you have to distinguish is that you're talking about two different outcomes, right? So it could be a strong and positive for one outcome, but then very negative or detrimental effect for others. So you were talking about growth, for example. An institution may have a very positive and large effect of growth, but very negative effect on inequality. So I'm not dealing with the normative implications of strong institutions for all arenas of politics or economics. I just say, then what we have to do is just be clear about which outcomes and which spheres we're talking about. Now, are there strong institutions could be very detrimental for society? Yes, the secret services under dictatorial regimes, the strongest they are, the most vigilance power they have, and the more damage they can do, right? I mean, so I'm not making an argument that all strong institutions are always good. Yeah,
right.
I guess it totally depends by context. And what is interesting about this project is that it's thinking about participatory institutions in democratic settings. I'm not thinking about democratic institutions in authoritarian settings, where I think that indeed you'd see there that a strong participatory institution may help legitimate a dictator. And one could say that was the goal of Chavez with participatory institutions there, or that was the goal of Pinochet with having more direct civic engagement at the local level.
Great, yeah.
Interesting. Next question, Gustavo?
So, I was thinking, so you have essentially two types of consultations. Ones that are binding. So if they are binding, essentially this is de jure veto power. So the community has the jure veto power over this project. If they are not binding, my measure would be, well, they should not change anything. Unless there is an informational channel. So the only way in which something that is not binding, and I will be asking you, will change the behavior if there is an informational channel. I will learn something that I didn't know before. So I would say that, and I would push more to think about what's that informational channel in those interesting cases, which are the non-binding ones, because the binding one, we know what is that. And I would be thinking something like what the federal governments do not know that they would like to know about these communities. I would go for something like a bargaining thing, but then the equilibrium is very easy. The community will look very tough because they're searching for bigger compensations, no? Mm-hmm. So you have to start thinking about a mechanism design. What would be the correct mechanism that will essentially give compensations, but also give some probability that you are not going to run the project if you ask too much.
Yeah.
So it's an informational problem at the end.
Yeah. It's possible that it could be modeled that way. I haven't thought about that approach. What I can tell you that one of the ways in which there are limits to negotiating forever are time constraints. So something that Evo Morales did was to pass a decree where there was a 3 months negotiation window, and it would be interesting to know what happens if that time comes up. I mean, I don't have that fine-grained information on the projects to be able to tell you that. But I mean, certainly firms are gaining a lot of information, more than the state, I would say, firms. And what we are seeing also is change in firms' behavior towards investment in local communities. I do think that at least some extractive firms, and particularly the internationals, more than the national oil firm are learning from these experiences and taking a different approach to community involvement and partnership with the communities.
But again, then what is, because one way of defining strong and weak is how binding is. So binding will be very strong, non-binding very weak, but this is not very useful for the informational part. What is good from the informational point of view could be very different from this point of binding versus non-binding, commitment versus non-commitment, and informational problems are very different things.
Anyway, we are running out of time, but let's thank again Tulia for her wonderful participation and sharing all her wonderful research. Thank you.